Video games have a lot to say about war.
War never changes.
War has changed.
There's a simplicity to war. Attacking is the only secret. Dare, and the world yields.
War is where the young and stupid are tricked by the old and bitter into killing each other.
Wars are fought for two things: survival or advantage. Battles may be won by the better soldier. Wars are won by those who are willing to sacrifice everything to ensure victory.
But why is war such a common motif in gaming? And what makes war so compelling to us? On a surface level, war does seem kind of cool with its grand scale, weapons, heroes, fighting, strategies, and I think we can all agree tanks and planes are epic. But we also agree war is bad. I mean, just ask Knuckles and Sonic Forces.
None of this is good, Vector. That's why it's called war.
Ask anyone about war and most will oppose it. But then why do we as humans do it so much? In fact, there are over 30 countries in some type of war at this very moment. And our obsession with war goes even further with the overabundance of movies and especially video games about war. Now look, clearly world peace isn't as easy as saying, war is bad guys, let's all just knock it off. But somewhere between war never changes and war has changed, video games reveal a strange truth about how we understand war and why it remains so compelling to us. The Fallout games take place years after the world had been ravaged by a nuclear war. However, in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, we find that despite a nearly total reset, things actually aren't so different. Sure, some people glow now and there are horrific mutated creatures roaming around, but human nature has remained the same. People still split into opposing factions and fight over resources. Petty squabbles turn into generational grudges that evolve further into large-scale battles. Despite a nuclear reset, human nature proves time and time again that the same mistakes will always be repeated. War is inevitable. Thus, the core philosophy of war never changes is shown throughout the games, and this is an idea that rings true for a lot of people. Time and time again, the same mistakes are repeated by history. For example, you'd think the world would have learned its lesson after the First World War, but the world actually decided to run it back with World War II. And even in our current day, countless wars continue to be waged. Sure, science improves, and even with the advent of miraculous technology such as nuclear power, people still find ways to fight and weaponize something with the potential to improve the lives of everyone. Looking back at history, we find that although circumstances change, the constant through line of war has remained unchanged. And if that's the case, why would we expect the future to be any different? This is the core idea represented by the Fallout games and why they remain so compelling to audiences. But looking at things a bit differently, Metal Gear 4 instead tells us that war has changed. Weapons have evolved beyond comprehension, and the reasons for fighting have become further estranged from those on the front lines. In Metal Gear Solid 4, war has taken on a new form. War isn't about hatred or ideology, war is truly about control. War has become an integral part of the world economy, and more like a business that's been fine-tuned for efficiency. Everything is monitored. Soldiers, weapons, and bullets all have ID tags, and soldiers infused with nanomachines are thought of as products rather than people. It is all about control, because by controlling the battlefield, you can control history. And in Metal Gear, battlefield control is achieved using the SOP, or Sons of the Patriot system. This system uses a network of nanomachines injected into soldiers to both monitor and enhance their performance. It is able to regulate their emotions, ensure only authorized use of weapons, and collect vast amounts of data. Increasing efficiency demands the removal of autonomy and individuality. And so, war has changed. Not because war isn't any more brutal and horrific, but because war has become controlled, industrialized, and given the appearance of sanitization. Violence hasn't changed, but instead become hidden and obscured with systems and screens. And this is another idea that is closer to reality than you might think, because like Metal Gear suggests, war is changing. People have become increasingly disconnected with war. For example, the use of drone technology which makes severe and deadly actions as simple as touching a button on a screen, creating both a physical and emotional distance between combatants. Additionally, corporate interests have wormed their way into various world governments, with many wars being funded by private companies. Finally, the idea of data collection rings more true each day, with data collection software and analysis being a major part of modern war strategy, provided to the government by companies like Palantir. Sure, we aren't injecting soldiers with nanomachines, but are we really that far off? So perhaps war has changed, or is at least in the process of changing, as we become increasingly disconnected from the atrocities that come with war and instead treat it as a banal necessity to keep the economy running. You can't talk about war in video games without talking about the war video game, Call of Duty. Although there have been more than 20 Call of Duty games made, I want to specifically talk about what is arguably the most culturally impactful of the series, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which was released in 2007. The previous Call of Duty games depicted war during World War II, which was a more historical setting and provided a more natural separation between the player and the idea of war. Modern Warfare, though, as the name suggests, made the decision to showcase war through a more contemporary lens, and the massive success and popularity of this game proved that players wanted to remove that barrier provided by history. But gamifying something as serious as war seems like it should be controversial. And it's not like people were particularly into war at the time either. In fact, anti-war sentiment in America had been steadily growing since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, with support dwindling even further by 2007. However, Modern Warfare's campaign isn't necessarily pro-war, as it does contain many scenes that showcase some of the more grim realities. But some critics have pointed out that the campaign is framed in a way that oversimplifies geopolitics and aligns with the narratives pushed by the US military. All in all, it actually ended up reflecting a lot of the feelings people were generally having towards America's involvement in war at the time, with US troop support remaining high, but an overall anti-war sentiment. But it's also important to consider how such a popular game about something as serious as war can be used, or perhaps even created, to shape people's opinions. There's a pretty popular belief that Call of Duty is made with the express intent to spread US military propaganda. These games certainly glorify the US military, framing their actions as justified, morally righteous, and of course badass. Even when looking at the campaign of Call of Duty Modern Warfare, we see that the war is pretty one-sided, at least in terms of who is in the right. In the real world, things are often much more complex and nuanced, and you might be thinking, well, okay, but it's just a video game and it's not really that serious. But these games are massively popular, and with their cultural relevance, the ideas and beliefs that simplify and represent war through such a gamified lens permeate through society's attitude towards war in general. But this offers another question. Is Call of Duty a result of our culture and society's attitudes towards war, or was it actually made to affect those attitudes and strengthen the status quo? We run into a sort of chicken or the egg situation here, but many do speculate US military involvement in the funding and creation of these games. As far as I was able to find, the US military does not directly fund the development of Call of Duty. However, they have worked with government officials, including Pentagon advisors, but just because Call of Duty isn't secretly funded by the US military doesn't mean it isn't propaganda. Regardless of intention, the Call of Duty games do serve to maintain the US military apparatus, at the very least indirectly. However, there is no need to speculate whether or not the government funds Call of Duty when there does exist a game funded and created by the United States government. That game is America's Army, a free first-person shooter released in 2002 made to educate and even recruit prospective soldiers. America's Army was a bit more realistic than something like Call of Duty, but was still more video game than simulator, and most people do speak pretty favorably of the gameplay. It had online PvP multiplayer as well as optional medical training missions, making it both an educational tool as well as a pretty fun video game. So how effective was this actually for recruitment? Well, a 2008 study from MIT found that 30% of Americans ages 16 to 24 had a more positive impression of the Army because of the game, and that the game had more impact on recruits than all other forms of Army advertising combined. All in all, I do find it pretty funny that American tax dollars went into creating a free video game, which I don't necessarily think is completely a bad thing. This game gets a lot of the same criticism that Call of Duty games get in regards to promoting the military-industrial complex, but at least we know they aren't hiding their intentions. The game was recently shut down in 2022, but this is probably just due to it being pretty outdated at this point. But use of video games in recruitment hasn't ended. In fact, the Army has a Twitch channel and even an esports team. However, it seems like these efforts aren't as successful, as the public's attitudes, especially among the younger generation, is becoming increasingly critical of the military and anti-war. Somewhat paradoxically, God of War takes a more humble route in its analysis of war. Instead of looking at things on a macro scale, we take a look at how war is systemically inherited and passed down through the eyes of one man, or should I say one god, Kratos. The original God of War trilogy tells the story of Kratos, a Spartan warrior who, in order to win an important battle, sells his soul to the god of war Ares. Kratos becomes a slave to Ares and is later tricked into killing his family. Motivated by vengeance, Kratos kills Ares, becoming the new god of war. But his thirst for revenge has not yet been satiated, as he murders his way through the Greek pantheon, keeping the cycle of war alive and well. After witnessing the death and destruction he caused, Kratos does feel remorse and releases his power and title in order to help the people of Greece salvage what little they have left. Although it's pretty heavily implied Kratos then dies from his injuries, the God of War series rebooted in 2018, this time showing Kratos as much older and now a father, as he grapples with change, redemption, and fatherhood. These games represent how war can trap people in destructive mindsets and how hard it can be to break through those chains. I see Kratos as a man molded by a Spartan environment. He was essentially bred for war, and that became his purpose in life. But due to his focus on war and winning battles, he ultimately lost his family, causing him to fall deeper into the ingrained ideals of bloodshed and war, until it finally reaches a tipping point, and he loses everything. But with the new God of War games, Kratos is given a second chance. That doesn't mean his baggage and past indoctrination aren't still there. He remains emotionally distant and prone to violence. However, he does want to be better, especially for his son. So he changes. He tries to be a better man and let go of the ideals that led him on that path of destruction all those years ago. I think these games try to show us how war can affect individuals and how certain elements of society reward aspects of war. Kratos grew up in a society that worshipped the idea of war, but all that brought him was pointless power in a dead family. In trying to be better, Kratos painfully sheds those aspirations and breaks the cycle of worshipping war, but is able to do so because he has people in his life that he wants to protect and support. And in the end, the game tells us that love is far more powerful than war. Although each of these games has something different to say about war, they all use war to make for an exciting setting that enhances their genre of action. But war has a much darker, uglier, and less appealing side. In fact, for most people, war isn't something they are actively taking part in, but it still deeply affects their lives. A game I think captures this idea perfectly is This War of Mine. This War of Mine has you control a group of survivors in a war-torn country, managing health, hunger, and mood levels. You can craft supplies, scavenge at night, and even meet other survivors who you can help or hurt. Your goal is simply to survive until the declaration of a ceasefire. This game is extremely depressing. Colors are drab, visuals are dirty, and the music is melancholic, but that's kind of the point. War is hard, and war is depressing. Instead of seeing things as action set pieces through the eyes of a warrior, you see it as an innocent bystander, someone who, in the grand scheme of things, isn't seen as important. I think the way the game ends is also pretty interesting. Instead of reaching some grand goal like killing a dictator or rescuing a loved one, all you can do is wait. You are powerless to affect anything about the war, and when the game ends, it simply reads, "The war is over. You've survived." Along with a montage of all the choices you made in the game, good and bad. Instead of focusing on saving the day, the game wants to ask, who will you be forced to become in order to survive? Did you help your fellow survivors, even if it meant less food in your belly? Or did you rob and murder, just to live another day? But the truly miserable part is, none of this is your fault. You are just another of thousands of victims, forced to make hard choices. And this is the reality of war for the majority of those affected by it. Most people aren't firing missiles, hunting down villains, or enacting vengeance. Most people are just trying to survive. And maybe it doesn't make for the most fun game, but it does make it much more authentic than most. Video games make for a pretty powerful tool when it comes to talking about war. I think it's easy to see war as an analog to a game. It's one side versus another, there is a winner and a loser, but this is kind of a reductivist way to look at things. And although much of society has conditioned us to think that way, battle and competition are just one small aspect to war, the shiny veneer of a much uglier beast. War is something that feels inevitable, something unchanging yet still evolving in new and perverted ways. Video games are fun, but they can also be powerful tools to shape our perceptions. Video games show us all the ways we think about war, the exciting and celebrated side, but also the grim and morbid side. War seems fundamental to the human experience, but maybe it doesn't have to be. We enjoy war in our video games because we have isolated it into its most palatable parts. I don't think people love war. I think people love games, and framing war as a game is certainly not the right way to look at things. But I think the reason war is so compelling isn't because it's rooted in who we are, but rather because we also deeply wish to understand it. Because with understanding, we gain the ability to change it. And so maybe war appears so often in video games because we want to understand it, hoping that one day we can finally break the cycle.